So, hello everyone, to the few people that are joining us here on Zoom, but anyone that's watching on YouTube as well. Welcome to the latest Future of Money event. Today we're joined by Albena Azmanova. Albena is author of Capitalism on Edge, How Fighting Capitalism Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or Utopia. Albena teaches political and social theory at the University of Kent's Brussels School of International Studies, and she's joining us today from Bulgaria, which is the first time we've had someone join us from Bulgaria, so that's quite exciting in itself. So, Albena, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself to start with, what your research is, what your background is?
Okay, thank you. It's very good to be talking to you in this podcast and to do it in my hometown. I arrived yesterday here. I was born in Bulgaria in the 60s and grew up basically under the dictatorship.
Yeah, I imagine that was an interesting time to be growing up in Bulgaria.
It shaped me very much. I was raised as a good communist, and that is why, as a good communist in the late 80s, I joined the dissidents movement to fight the dictatorship in the name of true communism, not in the name of capitalism. Must clarify that. And then when democracy came, we realized that it's a big sham. I went to do my studies first in Strasbourg, then I did my PhD at the New School for Social Research in New York. I eventually, got the long story short, I settled in Brussels, where I'm teaching for a British university, University of Kent, and doing a lot of policy advisory work also for the international institutions in Brussels. My work initially my research focused on theories of justice and judgment. My previous book is on judgment. It's called The Scandal of Reason, a critical theory of political judgment. And my recent book takes on, that formula of critical social analysis. I elaborated in that old book to the analysis of contemporary capitalism. To the analysis of contemporary capitalism, but without leaning on a socialist utopia. So this is the kind of the intellectual experiment I'm doing in this book, how to screen capitalism, contemporary capitalism, for opportunities for progressive change without counting on utopia, including the socialist utopia, because it's been discredited by the experience in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, China, without holding our breath for a crisis of capitalism. Capitalism is not in crisis. And certainly without the help of a revolution, because no such thing is in the offing. So we need to be able to engage in radical politics without all these three crutches. And this is the book.
Brilliant. So yeah, we will start with your book. So in some of the other shows you've done and in your writing, you kind of stress that you're not an economist. But something, as an economist, I guess I would say myself, because I've done that as a degree, but I wouldn't ever say I'm an accomplished economist. But having studied economics, one of the main focuses of economics is always inequality. Now, you stress very much throughout your book that this is kind of a misguided focus, that the focus shouldn't be on inequality, but it should instead be on precarity and the feeling of insecurity that people have in today's economy. So when you talk about precarity and insecurity, what exactly do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to clarify, it helps me to do good economics, probably or good economic analysis, because I'm not an economist. Now, what economists do is they measure what can be measured. Inequality is very easy to measure and very well, it reports well. But precarity is something more intangible. And yet, my analysis leads me to conclude in this book that really what haunts people, what worries people is this massive insecurity. So let me just clarify indeed what I mean by precarity. Such a word did not exist in the English language until about 10 years ago. It really entered dictionaries, precarity. about 10 years ago. The French have it, précarité. But the English word is precariousness. And yet I use precarity to speak about not just general insecurity of the human condition, or not even the general instability of modern life. It is something slightly different. And this is the politically generated, and I stress that it's politically generated through specific policies, economic insecurity and social vulnerability that harms people's material and psychological welfare.
Mm-hmm.
It harms also, as we have seen during the pandemic, it harms also society's capacity to cope with adversity and to govern itself. So this is this deep incapacity to be your own boss.
Right.
That is a result of specific policies. So in my analysis, this sense of deep vulnerability is at the root of the rising xenophobia, especially in Western societies. Also, the incapacity of the most affluent and scientifically advanced societies to cope with the COVID pandemic. Another important thing to remember is probably that precarity, the word precarity, expresses this utter lack of agency. It is derived from the Latin word precarious, which refers to something, a thing obtained through prayer or petition, through begging or through hope, through prayer. So you are really at the mercy of other forces.
Right.
What we have in our life now, we are controlled by our work, at the mercy of our bosses, and in the hands of governments who increasingly use autocratic, like law and order means to maintain social cohesion.
Yes. What do you think it means for people in their kind of day-to-day lives? What are they seeing that gives them this feeling of precarity?
I mean, different types of people, different groups of people experience that differently. But for many people, it means having to work on 3 jobs to secure the essentials of life. And usually these are unstable, precarious employment. For many young people, it is the incapacity even to find a job despite having 2 MA degrees.
Yeah.
Having to live with your parents until you're 30 and be generally unable to become economically and socially autonomous.
Yeah.
Now, for instance, I checked recently the statistics of youth unemployment in Spain. Currently, it's at youth unemployment in Spain is at 40%. Okay, 39. For other people, those, let's take the well-paid, on well-paid employment, it means staying forever in the rat race and paying for that with one's mental health. A recent Harvard study tracking CEOs found that most work 62 hours on average a week. And the most absurd, piece of information that came, it was sometime in March, Goldman Sachs young employees begged that their weekly working load be capped at 80 hours. So this is their precarity.
Yeah, I mean, how have we reached that point? Why are we in a world where people are having to work so much to feel that they almost, to fit into society, to feel that they have some level of security? I guess they feel they have to work more, but how have we actually reached that point?
Okay, so one could argue that insecurity is a feature of modern life, as I said, or that economic insecurity is part of the dynamics of capitalism, remember, creative destruction and all that. However, there always have been buffers against this instability of modern life, of capitalism, from unemployment insurance, public health care, to owning productive assets for the rich. This has been the buffers. But in recent times, at least sometime, I observe, especially the process has been aggravated around the early 21st century. These buffers began rapidly to disappear. And the story one of the stories that we can explain. It runs something like that. So we have the latest wave of globalization helped by IT, aggressive open border policies. So that global economic integration was complete around the end of the 20th century. And then the rules of the game for countries participating in the global economy slightly changed. The big change was the commitment, the policy commitment of governments to ensuring the national competitiveness in the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you remain competitive in the global economy? And competitiveness and competition are different things, because to maintain competition, you basically, like in the neoliberal times in the late 90s, just the governments had to ensure a level playing field, less intervention. But to ensure the national competitiveness in the global economy, you have to redistribute, you have to intervene in specific ways. One of the ways is to sponsor national champions. And usually these are big corporations that already have a competitive advantage in the global economy, but through taxation, through sponsorships, through, little sweetheart deals, you can enhance further their competitiveness in the global economy. Then in order to further to ensure national competitiveness, what you do, you slash public budgets for public services, such as healthcare. Precarious employment, so employment insurance drops. The social safety net is reduced because there are only that many resources for that. Yeah. So as a result, the competition on everybody, except for this handful of corporations, the competition on everybody increased.
Yeah.
So our personal livelihoods, like secure jobs, or even the ownership structure, you might own a company, you might own a business, but because of the competitive pressures are so severe, this still makes you precarious.
Mm-hmm.
So that's on personal level, but also on societal level, societies generally became more fragile.
Yeah. Now, what do you think the motivation for doing that was? Because the suggestion, like you distinguish between competitiveness and competition, for kind of a traditional capitalist ideology, competition is the foundation of that. So why did, generally perhaps right-leaning or definitely capitalist economies move against that to move into this world of competition, which is perhaps more what you'd expect from a state that's more centrally planned or centrally controlled?
Yeah.
Why did that?
That's the problem. One of the biggest paradoxes of our time, that I think the reason is because countries, governments, or entities like the European Union behave in the global economy as capitalist units.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not so much companies competing, but countries competing. For instance, the European countries compete against each other and with the US for access to the Chinese market. That has been one of the biggest drivers of this game.
Yeah.
And that is why then the state starts to intervene to save or to privilege specific capitalists against the general rules of capitalism.
Yeah, because the idea of a national champion is in itself against what any purely capitalist society would do.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, so it's suggesting that within the world economy, what would be agents within a national economy, the agents then become the states themselves.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, another thing that you wrote about in your book is about after the 2008 global financial crisis, which you would say is the biggest period of instability that most people alive now have ever really experienced. It was for decades we perhaps hadn't had something that shook the world in kind of such a way that so many people were affected by it. And then after that, there's been a further shift towards right-leaning political parties. Why was that shift to the right when the problem came from right ideologies? Why was the right consolidated after that?
Right. That's the other big, great paradox of our times. So if you remember about the time of the financial meltdown in 2008, and next 5 years or so, there was a lot of talk about the crisis of capitalism, and the left expected to see huge electoral gains.
Yeah.
But this did not happen. So this is because the vote actually went either to center right or to far right parties. And this is because insecurity makes naturally people conservative. They're longing for safety. They crave safety. So that makes them intuitively go to the right, to conservatism.
Yeah.
And this is particularly true in the absence of utopia. Now, if there was a plausible left utopia, like socialism, people might have moved to embrace that direction of history. But in the lack of such a positive utopia, the space is filled with other fantasies, such as those of ethnically pure and culturally uniform communities, nostalgic longing for a past that actually never existed. Yeah. So this is my explanation of this seemingly paradoxical shift to the right in circumstances of economic crisis.
Okay, and in what other ways do you think that the political spectrum has changed as well? So I know you talk about maybe a change from left and right being seen as what they once were. So in what other ways has that changed?
Okay, so that's a curious thing is happening. So the left-right divide has navigated up the political choices for at least about 250 years since the French Revolution. For most of that time, the left stands for a combination between economic protectionism, right? State-managed economy, and cultural liberalism, while the right stands for free markets and traditional cultural values. Now, I think this is more or less gone. Over the past 2 decades, the meaningful divide runs differently. On the one hand, we have parties and their followers who demand political order, economic security, personal safety related to fear of terrorism, and cultural purity or cultural protection.
Yeah.
These are the people who see themselves as threatened by the global integrated world and by the policies of open borders that created that world. Yeah. I call that the risk pole. But see, they want, these people usually, they want capitalism, but they hate the global capitalism and they defend national capitalism. They want social safety, they want the job protection for us, not for these strangers coming to get our jobs. So this is the risk pole. They see all the risks in that new setup.
Yeah.
On the other side is the opportunity pole. So people who see globalization as a source of both wealth creation, but also more authorship, more control of their lifestyle. So these are, think of the people who can do their job by their pool in Bali, who embrace this kind of lifestyle.
Yeah.
So they would go for exactly the opposite political policy set than the risk pole.
Okay, and do you think that kind of is how perhaps we explain how regimes manage to hold on to power? How, is it just a fear of change? You'd rather accept what we know than risk everything changing in a way that doesn't suit you, even if the opportunities might be greater.
Absolutely. But see, what's sad about that is that to tackle. Okay, here's the paradox. Capitalism has created. There's no crisis of capitalism economically, but it has created a lot of social problems, including, the climate change. Yet people, because they're insecure, are not prepared to embrace change. So paradoxically, the political defenses of the system are very strong, while society is in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Then, in order to embrace the change that we all need, the policy change, in order to protect the environment, in order to have better lives, we need a very radical change.
Yep.
But it is very hard to mobilize people that are averse to change. And it's a great opportunity that we're missing.
Okay.
Because of that combination between the economics and the politics of that juncture.
So what do you think the first steps are towards kind of reducing this insecurity then? What do you need to do to convince those people that change is needed?
So at least two things we can do. The greatest, we have to take care of the sources of precarity, of the sources that make people so insecure. And as I said, the greatest source of precarity is the competitive pressures coming from competition within global market.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing would be to recast globalization, of course, not to shut, our economies, but to recast globalization by inserting very demanding standards of environmental and labor protection in bilateral or multilateral trade treaties, just to make trade protect jobs and the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise there is always a race to the bottom.
Yep.
The next step, so once we have insulated a little bit, at least, our economies from these global competitive pressures, then we can think about, domestic economic policy. And I would start with jobs reform. Now, I don't believe in job creation. It's a very fashionable thing now in the US with the Biden administration, but I'm a big fan of the work of David Graeber's, his work on bullshit jobs. So Graeber observed, and it's a book that came about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. So he observed that over half of societal work is pointless. Now, moreover, pointless work is psychologically damaging, especially when we draw personal significance from our employment. So let's stop with the bullshit job creation. We're in a unique point in history where humanity has the technological means to produce its existence through through the minimal input of labor, thanks to automation. But automation is also the problem when our existence is so much dependent on jobs. So the economy, let's say that the economy creates exactly the type of jobs it needs. What we need is social policies to allow to share jobs. So in the book, my set of policy proposals concerns job sharing. Mm-hmm. So not artificial job creation, but job sharing. I call that the universal basic employment. Not the universal basic income. I think it's universal basic income is in principle a good idea, but it comes at the wrong time, because governments are way too indebted to afford to then spend money on what was Piketty's proposal, 250,000 we get at euro at the age of 25. No, this is just not serious. But we could do job sharing.
Okay, and what would that look like? So what would be an example of job sharing? Because why do we need people? How do we continue to pay everyone if people are sharing jobs?
Everybody would, of course, live with less, but they would have secure employment. And I think that this is exactly what hurts people, the insecure employment. When I was looking at surveys for my book, surveys of millionaires, most of them were saying that they are on the job, although they would like to retire, they would withdraw, live their lives, not worry about whatever jobs they were doing, out of a fear of losing it all. So you have to take away the fear of losing it all.
Yeah.
Fear of losing your investments, fear of losing your employment, fear of losing your livelihood. So how do you do that? Well, you do that by disconnecting social insurance, and including health and employment, etc., insurance, from the employment contract. Still, in many places, this is the case. You're only insured so far as you have worked, and the rest is too minimal to count. Still, in many European countries, self-employed people have very minimal coverage unemployment.
Yeah.
So there the tricks of the trade that can be done. Economists know very well how to do these things. I'm a political theorist. I shouldn't be telling them, although I have some ideas in the book.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like it would be, it makes sense. It'd be a great idea, but who's responsible for doing it? Is it governments that are going to do this, or is it companies that will lead the way in perhaps creating an environment in which this kind of job sharing could happen? Or, is it the individuals? Is it for us to push for this?
No, I don't think you can put the burden on individuals. Individuals can demand it. They can demand it from their the decisional elites, the people who make the decisions. But without state regulation, this cannot happen, because then we will all compete. Yeah? We have to stop the competition between people and between companies that leads to this race to the bottom. So once you set the standards and regulate for everybody that you cannot work more than 30 hours a week, or that everybody's should have a social and health protection irrespectively of their contract, labor contract. So you need to mandate these things. So it's fashionable again to talk about state intervention, but it depends what kind of state intervention. That doesn't mean much. It depends whether the state creates jobs, mandates how long and how much you work, or imposes, police surveillance, on the streets and in our private lives. It is all state intervention, comes in many shapes.
Yeah.
So the devil is in the detail.
Do you think it's, what kind of time frame are we looking at? Is this when the next rounds of elections come in? For every country it's going to be different, but is this what parties should be standing on, and which parties are you expecting to do it? Is this a solution for right-leaning parties to have more functional capitalist economies, or is it a solution for left-leaning parties to create a more cohesive society?
Left parties are still stuck on the issue of inequality. So right parties are still very much focused on competitiveness. What I believe should be happening. Look, the great changes in 20th century history. So the switch to the welfare state after the crisis of the 1930s. And then the switch to the neoliberal state, the neoliberal capitalism in the 80s. They were not initiated by any one political force. There was a big coalition of forces pushing in the same direction.
Yeah.
Take the transition to the welfare state that Polanyi describes in this fantastic book, The Great Transformation. There he tells the story of how the center-right, so conservative parties, socialist parties, the trade unions, even the Catholic Church, all pushed in the same direction. So I think that there needs to be this kind of cross-ideological
shift in attitude towards it.
Coalition coming from everywhere, like the multitude. I don't expect the multitude to raise in an uprising.
No.
Because of this fear of change, but I think people can demand from their leaders, irrespectively of left, right, nominal labels, to push in the direction of fighting precarity. And then what kind of social system would come out of that? We don't have to give it a label. It might be something brand new.
Yeah. Um, so you say the left actually are kind of stuck on the inequality question at the minute. How do we continue to address the inequality question at the same time? Like, do you think that's something that should be focused on, or is that something that you can leave and will sort itself if you sort out precarity? Or, and perhaps, where does this apply solely to developed countries? Is this something for developing nations as well? Is it Europe? Is it America? Where does it all fit in?
Look, the analysis is a great question. What do we do about inequality? I think above all, we need to fight poverty, because impoverishment and inequality are very different things.
Yeah.
Of course, we need to care about the poor, but if you embrace your capitalism as an engine of creating prosperity, if you value that wealth that is created by the rules of that particular game, then you have to be careful how you tinker, because equalization might actually disincentivize wealth creation, and then the poor would suffer most.
Yeah.
So we need to take care of impoverishment. We need to take care of precarity. And I don't think we should worry about economic inequality so much. I think actually this is a very new liberal preoccupation, because when you're talking about inequality, you're comparing the positions of individuals vis-a-vis each other. You're not talking about how societies are fragile. You're not talking about the commons, which is the typical, actually, socialist concern with the commons. So, and I would, I would think that the poor suffer not because somebody else has more, but because they don't have enough.
Yeah.
I have lived in a relatively egalitarian society that was terrible, when people were not very nice to each other. There was no really solidarity. We can imagine perfectly equal societies that suffer from precarity, because the economy is inefficient, because there are all kinds of competitive pressures, for instance. So I simply don't think that equalizing of economic resources is the solution. We need to do some of that. For instance, taxation. My construction here fell apart. So where was I? Yeah, taxation. I mean, we need to stop these loopholes that corporations don't pay taxes. This is simply not acceptable.
Yeah.
But this is a different issue than redistribution of resources. As a result of that, we will have more resources to invest in public services, for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So my last question before we go to the Q&A and anyone that's got questions to ask themselves is more kind of short term now. What do you think we'll see post-COVID? What do you think the immediate outlook is in terms of precarity? Are things going to get worse, or are things going to get better?
Now everybody's quite excited. It seems that changes in the thing. I actually think that what I describe as precarity capitalism, this deeply embedded, politically embedded insecurities will be reinforced, because governments have become now strongly indebted in fighting the COVID pandemic and the economic fallout from it. So there will be more belt tightening soon in order to stabilize public budget. So we'll have new cuts to social services, more precarious employment. Even if job creation is back on the agenda of ruling parties, this would be precarious employment, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
At the same time, hopefully it has become clear what the problem is, that precarity is the real issue, and political elites will be bothered to do something about it under public pressure. So we are really at the crossroads now of going back to where we were before a pandemic, or coming up with new solutions. The jury's still out, let's say.
I mean, let's hope it's new solutions, but you never know. And do you think a lot of all of this has been highlighted precisely because of the pandemic. It has shown where
should have opened our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll invite Alex back in to start the Q&A. Hi, Alex.
Hi there.
So yeah, if you'd like to take the audience.
Yes, absolutely. I'll start with mine. Thank you for the questions and the answers. It was quite heavy because the thing are pretty heavy discussion. So I'll try to light it up just a little bit. My father, Benedictus, my father is an economist, and I just realized that for many years I didn't understand what he was doing. So I understand why you don't want to label yourself an economist, Albena. I get it. It's a pretty tough job description. So here we have one, not yet, but I'll just ask mine. Imagine there is someone who's obviously watching this video and still living in an environment where there is a lot of oppression, whether it's a social, economic, and I know that I heard that you don't want to label things, but with me, I'll say, where do you go? Where do you attach your hope for the future? Do you go with democracy? I don't believe in that. Do you go with socialism? I don't believe in that. Do you go with libertarian, etc., etc.? What would you advise? Obviously,
I think that labels very dangerous because they're disconnected. They blind us to reality. So I would say, let's keep our eyes on fighting precarity, join forces on solving real problems, the real concern, responding to real concerns of real people, and really refuse the big labels. Democracy, I mean, what is democracy? Democracy is, okay, here comes what I think about democracy. So, yeah, this is very fashionable. I mean, in Europe, we have a conference on the future of Europe with public input. Now, you make people's lives dependent on precarious jobs that are polluting, destroying the environment. And then you want from them to be good citizens, good democrats, and pull themselves out of that and vote for some alternative future. This is so unfair. You cannot burden democracy with that responsibility. So if you're a good Democrat, do not burden democracy with things it cannot deliver. You cannot ask seriously people to choose between, as one of the yellow vest protesters said, choose between the end of the world and the end of the month. So this is the responsibility of our politicians, democratically elected, to avoid people to make that choice, secure the livelihoods so that people can be brave enough to think big and to embrace an alternative future.
All right. So if I understand well, you do not mix democracy and climate change, for example. It doesn't go really hand in hand.
Look, I think, as I said, we need to stay very close to reality. So I've looked at surveys. What it shows that most people worry about climate change. They know about climate change. They worry about climate change. And yet, when they have to choose at elections, they go for policies that affect their lives more immediately. And this has to do with, keeping the job, because the political economy has made our lives almost exclusively dependent on holding a job. So, yeah, I'm not saying that people are stupid, not at all. They know, they're well informed, but they're forced with, the kind of choices they're forced to make are just not fair.
All right. Okay. It seems like there's a Pete who would like to ask a question. I will invite you to just unlock your mic and ask directly the question. Go ahead, Pete.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, I just want to preface this by saying that was a very brilliant talk, and Albena, I'm very motivated to purchase your book now. So my question is based on sort of like the job side of the occupation side of the debate. And just wondering, preface with the knowledge that post-COVID and with the governments we have in place now may not be the ideal time, but you briefly touched upon a UBI, a guaranteed basic income, but sort of dismissed it on terms of unrealistic or over expensive. But I'd just like to come back to that point and say, how does this not solve all the issues of precarity and sort of issues of inequality we're talking about? There's been a lot of studies showing that the cost of a guaranteed basic income in lots of Western countries would actually be much less than what is spent on a variety of poverty policies now. And coming back to the idea of this bullshit jobs and these increased unnecessary occupation, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on maybe a guaranteed basic income in the future, and sort of this idea of separating income from the idea of occupation, which seems to be a root cause of a lot of the problems you were talking about.
Right. I confess that actually in the book I embrace universal basic income, but the book was written before the pandemic. Look, I think that the money we need as individuals, we need it in order to secure the essentials of life. Think about good healthcare. Nobody individually can be rich enough to secure for themselves good healthcare. You need for that investment in research, in hospitals, in more research, in public education even. So you need massive central investment in public healthcare. This is a public good. So this is not going to be solved through universal basic income. So I think that whatever resources we have first need to go to securing those essentials, and then think about just universal basic income is a good idea, but it is not the idea of solving.
Yes, no, it's definitely not the only idea. But I just think, personally, having studied it a lot, I think it could be in the future certainly used in conjunction with a lot of other policies.
That's what I'm saying in the book. But it is not the panacea that is being presented. Surely it would alleviate some of the psychological uncertainty.
Yes.
It's not going to solve the big problems that people are afraid of, because the big problems are structural, right? Let me give an example of something that really shocked me. In 2017, the European Commission suggested that we knew that the corona type of viruses were around, and the Commission suggested that companies should start developing vaccines. That proposal came within a private-public initiative called Innovative Medicine Initiative. Great idea, right? Well, Big Pharma said it's not profitable, so we don't support it. And the European Commission dropped the idea. This is what I mean, that this is the kind of economistic approach to things that should not be approached with considerations of profit. So this is really where we need to start changing things.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I have another question on the chat. So there is, what is the biggest factor in precarity? Is it the environment? Is it health, poor employment, or something else? From Maiwen. Thank you, Maiwen.
Oh, you really got me there. Biggest. So precarity comes from a person or a community or a state being placed in a position of responsibility they actually don't have the means to carry out. Like if I am made responsible for finding employment that doesn't exist, or for remaining healthy in a toxic environment. And this is exactly what individuals and societies have been faced. So the biggest factor, I think, it is the pursuit of profit, the profit motive. And it is not growth, mind you. I don't think the growth is the problem in itself, but it is the political commitment to growth. Because you can grow the economy by having, by a very reasonable and rational use of resources and economic activities, right? So you can have growth, but the very commitment to growth, like this example I gave with the Innovative Medicine Initiative, the very pressure to do only what is profitable leads to the wrong decisions and creates the precarity. So I think we should eliminate as much as possible the pressures for remaining competitive in the pursuit of profit. But then this is the very definition of capitalism. Capitalism is a system committed to the competitive pursuit of profit. So in fact, whether we admit it or not, if we commit to that idea of fighting this impetus, we would be exiting capitalism.
Absolutely. Well, that's there is another question from Ian. It says, there appears to be a growing political divide between urban and peri-urban and rural areas. Does this mirror the risk-opportunity divide you pointed in your book? Are cities equal, more cosmopolitan and connected to benefiting of globalism?
Yes, I think very much so. Actually, the divide is urban, rural, periphery, suburban. Why? Because the people living in urban areas are better equipped to reap the benefits of a global economic competition. Their culture is less threatened by exposure to new cultures. So yeah, they're just positioned to reap the benefits. So very much so, yes.
Okay. Let's see if there is someone else. Yeah. George, unless you have a question or anyone?
No, I don't really have any more questions, but I think it's super, super interesting what you've been talking about. And it does really give a different perspective on kind of the traditional way of approaching the issue and the issues that we kind of all face and what people are motivated by when they go to vote, what people see in their, what is controlling their lives. And to have kind of it laid out as a theory like this, I think it does make a lot more sense, and perhaps it's always been there and no one's quite been able to put their finger on it the way that you have. So that's really great. And
I think people have not been able to put their finger on it exactly because they're trapped in these labels: capitalism versus socialism. That's such a straitjacket for our thinking.
Yeah, it's all constructed, isn't it? They're words, and you're constrained by what language gives you in a way. But like you say, precarity didn't exist in English 10 years ago. So
that's very symptomatic.
Words can change. Maybe it's about time we reassessed what the spectrum looks like in terms of how we group people's thinking together. But yeah.
I'll ask the last question. Albena, are you optimistic for the future?
Well, isn't optimism just a matter of personal character? I think I cannot help it. I'm optimistic just because I cannot help it.
Good. gives us hope, I guess. That's really nice.
That's great. Well,
you can do it.
I mean, I try to be optimistic when I can, but some things make me less optimistic.
He's optimistic for tomorrow's game, so
Yes.
Yeah.
that's good.
So I'm always massively optimistic. I'd just like to show everybody Albena's book, so Capitalism on Edge, available from all good bookstores. Is that right, Albena?
Yeah, that's right. And note how thin that book is. It's a very quick read.
So I've been reading it over the last few days and found it very interesting. I'm a bit more centre right, I think, than the average. So I perhaps have some questions around how this could be put in place. Whether or not we need to a sort of a top-down approach, or whether we're more along the lines of personal responsibility. But I think that's a debate for another day. But yeah, certainly recommend the book. Anybody who's not already read it, there we go. Capitalism on Edge, very, very interesting. So thanks ever so much, Albena, for joining us. We really have enjoyed not only this conversation, but the other conversations we've had putting the event together. And obviously more than welcome to join us another time, especially when you get your next book out. Have you got a book in the pipeline?
Yeah, my book is next one I'm writing is called The Success of the West with a question mark.
Okay,
Ooh.
that sounds interesting. So when is that going to be in bookstores? Sometime early next year?
A couple of years.
A couple of years. Okay.
Very good.
Nice.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's been
Thanks for joining
wonderful.
us.
Great questions made me rethink again everything. Thank you.
That's the
No, it's
best.
been brilliant. We really
way.
appreciate it. We've had a great time putting it together, and really appreciate you spending your time with us and coming on. So thanks ever so much as well to all the guests out there in YouTube land, and also guests who've joined us directly on Zoom.